man's soul, and would I might be put at the head of 1,000 of them, that I might also show my valour against the famous town of Mansoul. Profane. Your wish may come to pass. You look like one that has mettle enough, and my lord will have with him those that are valiant and stout. But my business requires haste. Cerberus. Ay, so it does. Speed thee to the town of Mansoul, with all the deepest mischiefs that this place can afford thee. And when thou shalt come to the house of Mr. Mischief, the place where the Dibelonians meet to plot, tell them that Cerberus doth wish them his service, and that if he may, he will with the army come up against the famous town of Mansoul. Profane. That I will, and I know that my lords that are there will be glad to hear it, and to see you also. So after a few more such kind of compliments, Mr. Profane took his leave of his friend Cerberus. And Cerberus again with 1,000 of their pit wishers bid him haste with all speed to his masters, the which when he had heard, he made obeisance, and began to gather up his heels to run. Thus therefore he returned, and went and came to Mansoul, and going as afore to the house of Mr. Mischief, there he found the Dibelonians assembled, and waiting for his return. Now when he was come and had presented himself, he also delivered to them his letter, and adjoined this compliment to them therewith. My lords, from the confines of the pit, the high and mighty principalities and powers of the den salute you here, the true Dibelonians of the town of Mansoul, wishing you always the most proper of their benedictions for the great service, high attempts, and brave achievements that you have put yourselves upon for the restoring to our Prince Diabolus the famous town of Mansoul. This was therefore the present state of the miserable town of Mansoul. She had offended her prince, and he was gone. She had encouraged the powers of hell by her foolishness to come against her, to seek her utter destruction. True, the town of Mansoul was somewhat made sensible of her sin, but the Dibelonians were gotten into her bowels. She cried, but Emmanuel was gone, and her cries did not fetch him as yet again. Besides, she knew not now whether, ever or never, he would return and come to his Mansoul again, nor did they know the power and industry of the enemy, nor how forward they were put in execution that plot of hell that they had devised against her. They did indeed still send petition after petition to the prince, but he answered all with silence. They did neglect reformation, and that was as Diabolus would have it, for he knew if they regarded iniquity in their heart, their king would not hear their prayer. They therefore did still grow weaker and weaker, and were as a rolling thing before the whirlwind. They cried to their king for help, and laid Dibelonians in their bosoms. What therefore should a king do to them? Yea, they seem now to be a mixture in Mansoul. The Dibelonians and Mansoulians would walk the streets together. Yea, they began to seek their peace, for they thought that, since the sickness had been so mortal in Mansoul, it was in vain to go to handicrafts with them. Besides, the weakness of Mansoul was the strength of her enemies, and the sins of Mansoul the advantage of the Dibelonians. The foes of Mansoul did also now begin to promise themselves the town for a possession. There was no great difference now betwixt Mansoulians and Dibelonians. Both seemed to be masters of Mansoul. Yea, the Dibelonians increased and grew, but the town of Mansoul diminished greatly. There were more than 11,000 men, women, and children that died by the sickness in Mansoul. But now, as Shaddai would have it, there was one whose name was Mr. Prywell, a great lover of the people of Mansoul. And he, as his manner was, did go listening up and down in Mansoul, to see and to hear, if at any time he might, whether there was any design against it or no. For he was always a jealous man, and feared some mischief sometime would befall it, either from the Dibelonians within, or from some power without. Now upon a time it so happened, as Mr. Prywell went listening here and there, that he lighted upon a place called Vile Hill in Mansoul, where Dibelonians used to meet. So hearing a muttering, you must know that it was in the night, he softly drew near to hear. Nor had he stood long under the house end, for there stood a house there, but he heard one confidently affirm that it was not, or would not be long, before Diabolus should possess himself again of Mansoul, and that then the Dibelonians did intend to put all Mansoulians to the sword, and would kill and destroy the king's captains, and drive all his soldiers out of the town. He said moreover that he knew there were above 20,000 fighting men prepared by Diabolus for the accomplishing of this design, and that it would not be months before they all should see it. When Mr. Prywell had heard this story, he did quickly believe it was true. Wherefore he went forthwith to my Lord Mayor's house, and acquainted him therewith, who, sending for the subordinate preacher, brake the business to him, and he as soon gave the alarm to the town. For he was now the chief preacher in Mansoul, because as yet my Lord Secretary was ill at ease. And this was the way that the subordinate preacher did take to alarm the town therewith. The same hour he caused the lecture bell to be rung. So the people came together. He gave them then a short exhortation to watchfulness, and made Mr. Prywell's news the argument thereof. For, said he, an horrible plot is contrived against man's soul, even to massacre us all in a day. Nor is this story to be slighted, for Mr. Prywell is the author thereof. Mr. Prywell was always a lover of man's soul, a sober and judicious man, a man that is no tattler, nor raiser of false reports, but one that loves to look into the very bottom of matters, and talks nothing of news, but by very solid arguments. I will call him, and you shall hear him your own selves. So he called him, and he came and told his tale so punctually, and affirmed its truth with such ample grounds, that man's soul fell presently under a conviction of the truth of what he said. The preacher did also back him, saying, Sirs, it is not irrational for us to believe it, for we have provoked Shaddai to anger, and have sinned Emmanuel out of the town. We have had too much correspondence with Babylonians, and have forsaken our former mercies. No marvel then if the enemy both within and without should design and plot our ruin. And what time like this to do it? The sickness is now in the town, and we have been made weak thereby. Many a good-meaning man is dead, and the Babylonians of late grow stronger and stronger. Besides, quoth the subordinate preacher, I have received from this good truth-teller this one inkling further, that he understood by those that he overheard that several letters have lately passed between the Furies and the Babylonians in order to our destruction. When man's soul heard all this, and not being able to gainsay it, they lift up their voice and wept. Mr. Prywell did also, in the presence of the townsmen, confirm all that their subordinate preacher had said. Wherefore they now set afresh to bewail their folly, and to a doubling of petitions to Shaddai and his son. They also brake the business to the captains, high commanders, and men of war in the town of Mansoul, entreating them to use the means to be strong, and to take courage, and that they themselves would look after their harness, and make themselves ready to give Diabolus battle by day and by night, shall he come, as they are informed he will, to beleaguer the town of Mansoul. When the captains heard this, they being always true lovers of the town of Mansoul, what do they but, like so many Samsons, they shake themselves, and come together to consult and contrive how to defeat those bold and hellish contrivances that were upon the wheel by the means of Diabolus and his friends against the now sickly, weakly, and much impoverished town of Mansoul. And they agreed upon these following particulars. 1. That the gates of Mansoul should be kept shut, and made fast with bars and locks, and that all persons that went out or came in should be very strictly examined by the captains of the guards, to the end, said they, that those that are managers of the plot amongst us may, either coming or going, be taken, and that we may also find out who are the great contrivers amongst us of our ruin. 2. The next thing was that a strict search should be made for all kind of Babylonians throughout the whole town of Mansoul, and that every man's house from top to bottom should be looked into, and that too, house by house, that if possible a further discovery might be made of all such among them as had a hand in these designs. 3. It was further concluded upon, that wheresoever or with whomsoever any of the Babylonians were found, that even those of the town of Mansoul that had given them house and harbour should, to their shame and the warning of others, take penance in the open place. 4. It was, moreover, resolved by the famous town of Mansoul that a public fast and a day of humiliation should be kept throughout the whole corporation, to the justifying of their prince, the abasing of themselves before him for their transgressions against him and against Shaddai his father. It was further resolved that all such a Mansoul as did not on that day endeavour to keep that fast, and to humble themselves for their faults, but that should mind their worldly employs, or be found wandering up and down the streets, should be taken for Diabolonians, and should suffer as Diabolonians,